Now, I don't want to overload you with a bunch of Chainsaw Man content. You may like that, you may appreciate it, you may want that, but unfortunately, even though there's so many things I could talk about, I just don't want to split it up into separate videos and to try and nickel and dime every single aspect of it. I'd rather just combine it into singular videos and release them whenever it feels comfortable, right? I'm already kind of somewhat talking about the chapter, even though it's not necessarily a review and I don't want to pen it as a review, so hopefully that's okay. Don't worry though, I'll release a lot of Chainsaw Man content when I feel like it's worthwhile and something interesting to talk about. Like today, for example. Something simple, but a couple of different topics that I do want to mention. The first one being something that I've seen a lot of people feel kind of odd about. Not necessarily the biggest fans, having kind of a rough time being introduced into Chainsaw Man Part 2, and I think it makes for an interesting conversation. Denji not being in the story. Surprisingly, there's been an increase in people not really happy with the fact that he's not here at all. This is Chainsaw Man, this is Part 2 of the story, but our main character is nowhere to be seen. Rightfully so, people are a little bit upset, a little bit concerned, they want Denji back. I think people have the right to feel however they want to feel about a story, but I do think there is an opportunity to open up your avenue to experience something rather different. Not in the sense of that it's the most unique story you're ever going to experience, but more so just something else, to allow Fujimoto, the author, to creatively construct his story within his own vision. We have already had a beautiful showcase of Denji in Part 1, and don't get me wrong, we can still get a lot more for him, in a lot more new and unique ways. However, what we actually got was something a lot more surprising and, in my opinion, more beneficial and even interesting. Now, instead of us being comfortable with knowing where the story would go, we are completely lost. We don't know what could happen, we don't know who will survive, we don't know how subtle or simple Fujimoto wants to play his story to be, and that's all because he's changed the perspective. So even if you may not enjoy it, I think this is endlessly beneficial to the overall experience and something very new and refreshing that not a lot of authors get the opportunity to try and do. Removing your main character massively from the story and replacing it with someone else. There is a very massive margin of error. So talent, efficiency, creativity, and this uniqueness that Fujimoto brings is filling it up exponentially. Really thriving in this department and providing a story that feels different from Part 1, which again, very important. For now, Denji doesn't need to be in the story. We may not even ever jump back to his own perspective, and to be entirely honest, I think I'm perfectly okay with that. After seeing the first 3 chapters of Chainsaw Man Part 2, with how Fujimoto wants to take this story and how he's writing these characters with so much efficiency, so much beautiful finesse and sensitivity, it really makes me excited. These characters will be slowly and methodically pulled apart and played upon in so many incredible ways. And this is something that he's actually pretty fond of doing. A lot of his previous works will have this exact same method of storytelling, but for more side characters, not as pivotal or important. Obviously now it is our main character, and you can see all of the work that he's putting into this, and he's taking his time. He really wants to build this duality, the conflict, the comparison between Asa and Denji, their situation, what they've become, what they're brought into, their mentality, their emotions, everything. Very similar but ultimately different, and having them side by side eventually is going to be wonderful. But see, where the beauty of Denji not being in the story actually comes into play is because we're focusing so much on Asa and building her up, we don't know her future. Realistically, what sounds nice currently is that Asa and Denji would get together, that they would potentially fall in love because they feel this void for one another that they're both seeking. Sounds pretty interesting, right? And sounds like something that could actually happen. However, is it ever that simple with Fujimoto? One of you's brought up a very devastating theory in my previous video, and I absolutely love it. Basically, it was saying that imagine we spend all of this time with Asa and creating her character and getting emotionally invested and connected with her, only for her to be killed off by Denji the instant they actually meet, in the most gruesome, horrific, and tragic way that you can imagine. When I think about Fujimoto and the endless possibilities that surround his type of writing, this is equally just as accessible as Denji and Asa falling in love, or becoming friends, or pursuing some sort of relationship. This is a very scary thing to have, and it works so incredibly well because Denji is not our main perspective anymore. We know what to expect from Denji. He may be tweaked or changed a little bit because of his schooling career, but I still imagine he's somewhat of the same individual, just learning a lot more, experiencing the world, being around people. There is a lot of ways this story can go. Have faith in Fujimoto when it comes to Denji and him not actually being within the story, because he's still, funny enough, being utilized in a very massive way. His fame as Chainsaw Man is intoxicating intoxicating. It's filled to the brim within the world. Every single chapter you will see something relating to Chainsaw Man. So of course Denji as a human, as a student, will come into play eventually. But having that all driven through Asa Mitaka and her perspective is going to be incredibly fun to indulge within and refreshing. This however takes time, and you've seen that firsthand. Now that Fujimoto is within Jump Plus, he can really lengthen out chapters, cut them short, and have them very oddly paced to perfection the way he wants it. You've probably noticed that chapter 3 feels very odd in its pacing, very odd in its atmosphere or its intensity. Something doesn't feel right. And this was the Yuko and Asa shoeless situation running back to Yuko's house. Something felt wrong, and you can actually get this sort of feeling and multiple versions of it just through the pacing being very slow and methodical or even inconsistent, specifically sped up in places but dragged out, slowed down, or cut short in others. This is done on purpose. This is to build a very specific attention span to Asa Mitaka as a character, to craft and mold her as an individual and to shape her identity into us so we can understand who she is, what she's going through, and how she's reacting to everything around her. Even though Fujimoto may be taking his time, it is very beneficial for the story, for the characters, for this incredible, intoxicating atmosphere and tonal shift that he's building. Chapter 3 alone is a tone of chapter that we have not felt in the entirety of Chainsaw Man Part 1. It feels odd, and that is a really good thing. So if you don't enjoy it, that's perfectly okay, but there is still going to be that chaoticness that you know and love from Part 1. The first chapter was quite literally that. Fujimoto is just expanding his range, and now that he's in a new magazine, he can finally do that. Jump Plus is allowing him that opportunity to craft the pacing and the identity of his aesthetic a lot more, with how he wants to write characters and situations, scenarios, and to build an overall tension or atmosphere. So obviously there was a handful of different topics within there, but they're all kind of linked and segmented together. I want to talk about one that I think is kind of funny, but also just a little bit all over the place, obnoxious. It's very simplistic. You might have heard an idea going around that Yuko, the new character that was just introduced that is befriending Asa, is actually Denji. I don't know where this theory came from or how it was born. The only real thing that I could think of is that Yuko had a very similar axe that she was wielding to Denji in Part 1. And I believe one thing led to another, glasses, face structure, whatever, and somehow it's got to this point. I don't think this is a dangerous, disingenuous, or destructive theory. I think it's just someone having fun. I think they're just coming up with a quirky idea that sounds funny within their own head and kind of just throwing it out into the world, and a lot of people have ran with it in a pretty wild way, both somewhat positive and supportive in the creatively concept approach, and others not so much. Personally, I don't really care for it. I don't really think it does anything for the story or for Denji, etc., etc. But then again, that's just my opinion. If you hate it, love it, despise it, it's entirely up to you. But that person can create whatever theories they want, and this one's stuck with the community in some right ways and some wrong ways. Ultimately, I think it just goes to show how interpretive Fujimoto's works are. There's a lot of theory crafting, a lot of twists and turns that you can create to really build a picture that may not even be there within the story. It's a very fun thing to do. It's very intoxicating, but it can also be dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that you tend to build an expectation. And I have talked about this previously, that when you start to theory craft, you start to lose sight of the story, which is something that Fujimoto himself has talked about. As long as you don't lose sight of the story, you should be fine. But don't let your expectation from that theory crafting ruin your experience with the story, because your headcanon, your idea, your theory didn't come true shouldn't become a negative factor for how you read the story. It is completely fine to build these theories. Just don't build up your expectation as something that may never be met. If anything, something that sounds a lot more plausible currently is building up Asa and Yuko's relationship and having Yuko killed. Very tragic, very sad, heartbreaking. I think a lot of people are currently already expecting it, but obviously we never know. The story could completely contort itself into something else entirely, which it is kind of already done, and it has provided a breath of fresh air for the story, a new hook, a new interpretation, and something that is fun to experience once again. It's still Chainsaw Man, but within a different light. And eventually those two lights will merge, one that we've previously experienced with Denji, and obviously our newest one with Asa. How we get there, however, how long it takes, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's brilliant. It seems like he's having a lot of fun just flexing so many ideas that he wants to bring to the table. With that, however, I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Leave a like and subscribe, I greatly appreciate it. it, drink plenty of water, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.